From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Jerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to the Free Expression podcast from the Wall Street Journal. I'm Jerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, please sign up wherever you do your podcast listening. This week, it's almost over. Or is it? As the seemingly interminable campaign reaches its final few days, we're going to take as our inspiration this week the line once used by a famously windy senator at the end of a long debate in that august chamber. Everything that can possibly be said has already been said, he declared. The problem is, not everyone has said it yet. Well, we're less than a week now from voting day, and still the storm of another close election has not broken. Two candidates remain deadlocked in the national polling, and also, it seems, in the states that will decide the outcome in the Electoral College. Now, barring some last-minute surge for either candidate, or the possibility that the opinion polls have been dramatically wrong all along, we are staring once again at the unsettling probability that we won't know who's won the presidency, or maybe control of Congress, for days or maybe even weeks. But let's leave the post-election turmoil, at least until the post-election period, and instead take one final look this week at the state of the race. And in particular, ask whether in fact the outcome might be less in doubt than perhaps people think. Well, to talk about this and how the campaign's gone and what we can expect in the final few days, I'm joined this week by veteran pollster Doug Schoen. Schoen has been in the polling business for almost 50 years, having co-founded his consulting firm of Penn, Schoen and Burland in the 1970s. He's worked for innumerable candidates and campaigns, including those of Bill and Hillary Clinton, as well, of course, as Republicans and independents. He's a prolific commentator and a regular contributor to multiple publications, including, I'm glad to say, the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And Doug Schoen joins me now. Doug, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Happy to be here, Jerry.
Okay, well, I'm not going to ask you the obvious question, which is who's going to win the election, but we've been fixated on the polls now for such a long time, and there's actually been apparently very little movement. This race still seems to be more or less deadlocked. We start with a slightly unusual question, though. Polls have been wrong, quite a bit wrong in the last few elections. What's the chances, do you think, that we could get a surprise next week, and that instead of a very close result, one side or the other actually wins quite comfortably?
Yeah, I think it's more likely that happens for Trump than for Harris, but I'll offer both scenarios. The Trump scenario is a more conventional one, and one that's a variant of what we saw in 2016 and 2020, which is that there are reluctant Trump voters, Republicans are somewhat more difficult to reach, and the low propensity voters turn out for Trump. That could be worth a point or two nationally and potentially in those swing states as well. And as you know, given your first comment about how close the polls are, an extra 2 points for Donald Trump across the board could produce a electoral victory for him well in excess of 300 electoral votes. I guess I would say similarly, but probably less likely, Jerry, is if younger people and younger women turn out in great numbers for Kamala Harris and minorities move back to their historic levels of support for the Democrats, then Harris could perhaps get a similar bump and win a more clear victory herself. But as we sit here today, I'm more likely to bet that whatever inaccuracies or in error there is in the polling will benefit Trump rather than Harris.
Well, again, we've all pored over this, and we know that the polls underestimated Trump's support in 2016 and in 2020, both against Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. And then there's this interesting phenomenon we had in 2022. And I've looked at this in some detail, actually, and the narrative is not quite right that the polls significantly overstated Republican support then. There was an expectation of a red wave, although that was, in part, I think, kind of a sort of a political narrative, a sort of a media phenomenon, not necessarily in the polls. It seems slightly overstate Republican support, and certainly in some states, there's no question about that. But there wasn't like an overestimation to the Republicans in the way that there had been to the Democrats in the previous two elections. Do you agree with that? I mean, and do you think that, perhaps more importantly, what level of confidence can we have that in either direction, pollsters have been able to take to account for this apparent error that we've been seeing, and that the polls this time really will be more or less accurate?
Well, I don't think we have any level of certainty that they'll, quote, be more accurate, because it's very hard to know how best to draw a sample because we don't know who's going to vote. And frequently, Jerry, given the internet and how people communicate now, we don't really know with specificity and precision how to draw a sample. I would say the difference between 22 and 2016 and 2020, that to me is both obvious and most important is that Trump wasn't on the ballot in 2022. The lower propensity voters do not vote in off-year elections, and that's who Trump appeals to.
The other thing you hear a lot about in terms of how the result may possibly differ from what the poll suggests is that maybe the Democratic turnout machine, the get out the vote, is worth a point or two. I do know there are some concerns on the Republican side about how effective their get out the vote operation will be. Do you give that much credence?
I do. I don't know if it will overwhelm the three factors I cited in terms of reluctant Trump voters, more difficult to reach Trump voters, and low propensity Republicans. But I think that the Democratic turnout effort, certainly in 2020, was superior to the Republican effort. But Republicans this year are voting early, voting by mail, and have not in any way bought into the notion that they should only vote on Election Day. So I think that some of the advantage that the Democrats had built in will necessarily not be fully realized given the Republicans' participation in the early vote.
What can we say about the early vote so far, Doug? I know you've been looking at it. We've all been looking at some states don't have party registration, so it's kind of hard to tell who's voting. A lot of states do, however. What we are definitely seeing is a significantly larger proportion of the early vote, I should say, at least being Republican voters or Republican registered voters this time in key states like Pennsylvania and others than it was in 2020. Can we read anything into that? Because obviously that might look like good news on the face of it for Republicans, but it could simply be that, more Republicans are voting early rather than voting on the day, rather than kind of lifting overall Republican turnout. Are you seeing anything in the numbers that could be significant?
Nothing that I regard as definitive or dispositive. I mean, on the level that you outline it, it could be beneficial to the Republicans, but on the other hand, it could just be Republicans feeling that they can and should vote early in ways they didn't 4 years ago or even 2 years ago. So I don't read much into it at this point, and I also don't read too much into the Democrats' assertion that younger people are voting earlier and there are more women showing up and thus there's a woman's wave for Harris. I don't buy that one either.
Can we say anything again about maybe the overall turnout this time? We had obviously very, very high turnout. 160 million Americans voted, which was up by 20 plus million votes. In 2020, up by 20 million votes from 2016. Do you think we're seeing already, and will we see next week, 2020-like turnout levels?
Yeah, I think we will see a 2020-like turnout. I think, yes, people are very angry, but the level of anger and animus is what's going to provoke and promote them to vote in record numbers.
What do you make of the sort of closing messages of the campaign? It does look as though Kamala Harris has basically gone with, sort of Trump's character. We're recording this, I should say, on Wednesday. She had her big event at the Ellipse in Washington on Tuesday night, where she went after Trump's character, but then did lay out a sort of larger agenda. But that has been very much the theme. We've heard this talk about fascists and comparisons of Trump's Madison Square Garden rally to Nazi rallies and this kind of stuff. Very much seems to be focused on the character. You never quite know with Trump because he does his own thing, but Trump does still seem to be coming back to the core issues of immigration, the economy. I mean, again, from what you know of inside campaigns, what do you think this is telling us about what the campaigns are seeing and how they're responding to it?
Well, I'll start with Harris. The Harris campaign recognizes that if this is a fight about policy, they lose because people feel that Trump's policies on the border, on crime, and most of all the economy were superior and their quality of life was better. So Harris understands that she can't make the case that things were better under her and Biden than under Trump. What she can make the case is that people like and trust her more than they like and trust Trump, who was seen as too extreme and somebody who was polarizing and divisive. So she's trying to use her personal narrative to extend the argument. That's her closing argument. I watched Trump yesterday, Jerry, and his closing argument is pretty much limited to one issue: immigration.
Again, things crop up in the final week in perhaps unexpected ways, not quite October surprises, but there's a lot of garbage floating around the political airwaves at the moment. At the weekend, of course, at that Trump rally, the comedian who referred to Puerto Rico as a floating island of trash, that didn't sound very good. And then, of course, Joe Biden yesterday trumped that, if you'll forgive me, by saying that Trump's supporters were garbage. Is this all sort of chaff at this stage, or do you think there is a possibility that either of these could have any significant effect.
Well, I think the effect of Biden's comment was that it turned the attention away from the comedian Tony Hinchcliffe's comment about Puerto Rico. That being said, I don't think on Election Day, 7 or so days from now, we're going to be endlessly analyzing what Hinchcliffe said in the rally or what Biden said in response to the rally. I think it'll be decided based on the factors we see in the polls, not last-minute rhetoric.
Tens of millions of people have already voted. Are there any undecided voters left out there at this stage? And again, you've been through many campaigns. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question. We tend to think in the media that undecided voters are very thoughtful people who read every newspaper, have a checklist, and are super well informed. It's the opposite. The undecided tend to focus less, know less, be less interested, and make a decision almost seat of the pants at the end. So what we know is they're low interest, they're angry, and they don't like either one.
What do we know about the key states right now? Again, I'm literally looking in front of me at the polling there, these 7 states that everybody's been very focused on. If you look at whichever average you choose to take, it's incredibly close in all the states. Maybe Trump has a very slight advantage in Arizona. Everything else seems to be pretty well split. Do you expect those states to go all in the same direction next week, assuming they do? Well, if it's so close, I suppose they could go either way. But these states in these close contests, they do tend to go in the same direction. What's your reading of those?
That is my reading. My reading is that the swing states will break in one direction or the other. The momentum, as I'm sure you've seen and noted, Jerry, even if it's glacier-like movement, has been to Donald Trump. And if I had to predict, I would say the most likely outcome is that there will be slow but continual movement in Trump's direction, which will produce, my guess, is somewhere between 4 and 6 of the 7 swing states going in his direction. That, to me, is the most likely outcome.
We're going to take a short break there, but when we come back, we will have one last look, I promise, at the 2024 presidential election campaign with veteran pollster Doug Schoen. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Jerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Jerry Baker.
I'm back with pollster and political consultant Doug Schoen. We're talking about the final days of the 2024 presidential election campaign. There's been some interesting debate among pollsters in the last few days about how close the polls, I don't just mean close in terms of the parties, but how the polls themselves seem to be sort of clustering very close. We've hardly had a single poll in a state or on a national level, which you typically get, which can be perhaps viewed as an outlier, where one candidate has a significant advantage. The remarkable thing about these polls is just poll after poll after poll in state after state showing the race 1, 2, 3 points at the most. There is this argument that maybe pollsters are herding, I think they call it, right, which is that they're tweaking their results so if they get something that seems out of line, they don't want to be out of line because you don't want to be there when election day happens and people can say, look, your poll was 10 points out or whatever. Do you think that is going on?
I suspect on some level it is. And the tip-off is when you read, as you do in some polls, that they, quote, weight to past vote or known demographics. What that means is they can adjust the raw results they get to anything that they so choose.
That does raise the possibility, I suppose, that all the polls all pointing in the same direction, that they should at least alert us to the possibility that they could all be wrong and we could end up with a clearer result one way or the other.
That is true.
In the final days, you talked about on Harris's side, the key message is really Trump and Trump's character and about character. On Trump's side, it's really immigration. Is there anything else at this stage that might, either motivate perhaps slightly reluctant Trump or Harris voters to come out, or that could swing that little band of undecided voters that we still have?
I think the simple answer is yes. If I were advising Trump, which I most assuredly am not, I would say go back to the Ronald Reagan line. Are you better off or worse off today than you were 4 years ago? That works to Trump's advantage. Why he only wants to talk about immigration when the vast majority of people are much more concerned day to day with their economic well-being is hard for me to fathom.
Would you also advise him to get Nikki Haley out on the stump with him?
Absolutely. Given where we stand, I would be sending Nikki Haley to the swing state, swing area. So I would have her in the Philadelphia suburbs. I'd have her in Georgia. I'd have her in North Carolina. I probably would have her in Michigan and Wisconsin, too.
And for Harris, is there anybody or anything in the last few days that she should, kind of pull out of the hat that, again, might help her?
The one thing that I thought she might want to do is do something in Pennsylvania where she would get both Clintons, both Obamas together for a final unity rally with Joe Biden.
Yeah, that would be quite a spectacle. And do you think they've obviously, on the Harris side, they've been very concerned, expressing concern about the black vote, particularly black men. Do you see enough evidence in the polling to suggest that they're right to be concerned about that?
I think they're right to be concerned. My guess is they will do somewhat better than the polls show with black men on Election Day. Whether they'll do well enough to eke out a narrow victory in a state like Pennsylvania, time will tell.
Another thing that's been very noticeable about Harris in the closing stages, just as she has through the campaign, is the issue of abortion. She really keeps hitting that hard. She hit it hard again in her rally on Tuesday evening. Again, what you see in the polling, what's the saliency of abortion and how important could it be?
The salience is very great. For women under 40, even under 50, it is probably their key voting issue that motivates them. And it will produce turnout where perhaps there would not be a vote cast, and it will motivate those who are reluctant of all ages to at least have a reason to vote for Harris, because other than her personal narrative, she doesn't really have too many strong issues working for her. Abortion is probably the strongest one.
Let's talk about the race for Congress. Again, it seems in the Senate, the Republicans seem to have a pretty clear advantage. Clearly, they're going to pick up Joe Manchin's West Virginia seat. They look very likely to knock off John Tester in Montana. That would give them a 51-49 majority. Do you think they can go further than that? Or indeed, as a Democratic strategist said to me yesterday, could the Democrats actually hold on by taking back, say, Texas from Ted Cruz, or this sort of interesting populist Labor independent candidate in Nebraska? How do you see the Senate playing out?
Well, I think the Republicans will end up with 51, 52 seats. I think Ted Cruz will hold on, so will Rick Scott, in my estimation. I think Deb Fischer probably will hold Nebraska over the independent candidacy of Labor leader Dan Osborne. Wisconsin could be a nail-biter, though I expect Tammy Baldwin ultimately to prevail. So I see a 51-52 seat Republican majority, and I'd be hard-pressed to see the Democrats flip a couple of seats. It certainly could happen, but I doubt it will.
And in the House, it's another close contest, but general expectation seems to be that it probably goes the way of the presidency. Is that your view too?
In a certain sense, yes. The one caveat is there were a number of Republican pickups in New York State and California in 2022 because of local factors. I suspect there are 3 to 5 seats that are hypothetically winnable in New York and California for the Democrats that could, if Harris is very competitive, give Democrats control of the House. So I'd say there is a narrow possibility the Democrats take the House, a possibility that will be facilitated by not only Kamala's vote nationally, but her vote in hard and strong blue states like California, New York, New Jersey, and the like.
All right, let's look forward to Tuesday evening, those of us who have the stomach for it, Tuesday evening into Wednesday morning.
Yeah.
As those returns start to come in and we'll get East Coast states, obviously relatively early, key swing states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and then obviously off into the Midwest, what should people be looking for? In particular, are there any barometer counties, districts that we should be looking for? As results come in, what will you be looking for to give you a sense of where this is going?
Well, I want to see how big the margin is for Harris in Philadelphia, how big the margin is in rural areas for Trump. As you said, black men versus black women, the Hispanic vote, both in Pennsylvania, where it's predominantly Puerto Rican, and in Arizona and Nevada, where it's predominantly South American. Those are key indicators for me.
They're always kind of some sort of a surprise on election night. If you had to pick whether it might be a state that people haven't been talking about being closer, perhaps suddenly becoming a swing state that we weren't expecting, or whether it is maybe a Senate seat, what are the 2 or 3 potential surprises you'd be looking for?
Well, if Minnesota or Virginia look close, that will mean a very good night is in the offing for Donald Trump. if we see that the Texas and Florida Senate races are close, again, a harbinger of good for the Democrats, that will probably suggest that Osborne has a chance in Nebraska. So I'm sitting here thinking that the congressional election will be relatively static and consistent with the final polls. But if we get a lot of tumult, it could mean that at the presidential level, there'll be some pretty big surprises.
The chances that there will be contests, legal challenges, great uncertainty, is that more or less guaranteed now, you think?
I think it is absolutely guaranteed. And I don't blame just the Republicans here. I have no doubt Trump, if he loses narrowly, will do something similar to what he did 4 years ago. And I am almost equally certain the Democrats, if they lose narrowly, will do as Hillary Clinton did and deny the legitimacy of the 2024 election.
Well, I was hoping we'd be able to say that that's it for the contest of 2024, but I suspect we may still be talking about this in the next week, 2 or 3.
I'm afraid you may be right, Jerry.
Doug Schoen, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thank you. Always my pleasure.
Well, that's it for this week. That's it, we hope, for this election, or at least for this election campaign. I'll be back, of course, next week in the aftermath of the election results, or perhaps right in the middle of the election results. Who knows? We're going to have to wait and see what happens Tuesday night and into Wednesday. But I hope you'll join us next week. In the meantime, get some rest, stay calm, and we'll look forward to speaking to you next week. Goodbye.